Hey, welcome to Stuff to Blow Your Mind Trailer Talk. We're back once again to watch a few movie trailers, some additional footage, and spin off of what we talked about this week on the podcast.
Now, we are the hosts of the Stuff to Blow Your Mind podcast, a science podcast that tries to peel back the curtain and show you that on any given topic, there's probably more than you thought. Robert, who are you?
I'm Robert. I'm one of the hosts of this podcast. And who are you, gentlemen?
I'm Christian Sager. I am also one of the co-hosts on Stuff to Blow Your Mind. Hello.
And I'm Joe McCormick.
Yeah.
Did I cut you off? What were you saying?
No, it's okay. I was just saying hello. This is a weird science show. It's a podcast mainly, although we also do video and blog content. If you visit stufftoblowyourmind.com, you'll find everything that we do. Presumably, if you're here, you're either already following us on Facebook or a friend of yours is following us on Facebook, so you're seeing this video in your feed. So if you haven't checked us out yet, please do. Go check out the show. We go way more in-depth than we do on this video, on this live video, about the topic of Sexbots in this week's episode. It actually came out just yesterday.
Now, the premise of our trailer talk is that every week on the podcast, we inevitably end up talking about lots of movie references. I think we all watch way too many movies. And so this is a chance for us to actually look at the trailers for some of those movies or scenes from them, talk about how they apply to the topic from the podcast this week. And, of course, this week's topic is sex robots.
That's true.
So before we get started, I do want to remind you, please do leave comments if you've got questions about what's going on. But we're not going to reward you if you are nasty, gross, sexist, whatever. That stuff's going to get ignored. But if you've got something interesting to contribute or just want to say hi, please chime in and we'll try to address those as we go.
There's actually some really interesting stuff connected to this topic of sex bots that isn't salacious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's why we wanted to do this episode.
Maybe you guys can start off by selling me on the concept, because you two were on the episode. It's this week's episode. What is the title of it?
Well, the title is Sexbots, From Objectification to Therapeutic Surrogates. and in fact, the image that we're looking at in the background here is a bit of robotic pinup art from Hajime Sorayama. And we reference this artist in the episode. And I think it's a great place to start because this really illustrates what I think a lot of the pop cultural surface ideas about sex bots come down to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a whole line of inquiry into sex bots in philosophy studies and sometimes in AI, which is sort of should these be things that we're developing because not only are we building these gross objectified machines, but subsequently the idea it also comes back that the sex bots themselves objectify women and young children. And so some people argue that they shouldn't be built at all. Other people argue they should be built specifically for therapeutic purposes. So we're going to talk about this later as we go through the trailers, but sex bots are really useful in helping people with PTSD, people who have sexual dysfunction issues, and people who have come back from war, like people who have lost limbs and stuff like that.
Well, potentially useful. So because we're not quite to the point where we have it, but I think that's the fascinating thing is the technology is pretty much inevitable. We're moving in this direction. So what is going to be the shape of the future?
Right. So do you want to go? Does that answer your question, Joe?
Sure. Well, I've got an open mind now, so I'm ready to hear what you think, informed by some strange movie selections. But before we get into the first trailer, I do just want to remind you, if you're not a listener to the Stuff to Blow Your Mind podcast, go check us out on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can go to stufftoblowyourmind.com, or you can look up Stuff to Blow Your Mind on iTunes and hit the subscribe button to start finding out what we're about.
And hey, before we get started, how about we ask the audience a question, just like a primer question? So maybe something like, why did you click on this? First of all, if you saw sex bots in big yellow letters in this robot, what did you think you were going to find here, and what are you hoping to get out of the interaction with us?
I guess another priming question would be, what are your basic ethical intuitions about sex bots?
Good.
Is the idea of a sex robot inherently something that you find morally or ethically acceptable? If so, why? Or if not, why not?
Okay, so let's start with our first trailer. This one is brand new to me, but Robert just went and rented it yesterday. It is 1987's Cherry 2000.
Yeah, released in 87, I believe filmed in 85. This is a this is a fun movie. So I have fond memories of it from when I was younger, and I just rewatched most of it. So there are basically two settings for this film. A futuristic world that could only have been created in 1985. We're seeing that here. And sort of mildly Western-themed, post-apocalyptic wasteland.
And so the premise, as I understand it, is that this guy has a sex bot. He's
There she is, yeah.
absolutely in love with her. The model, the physical model, is a Cherry 2000, which is kind of like a rare old model. He's able to take her memories out onto this like little mini disc and put it into any robot he wants, but he only wants that same physical frame.
Right. Here he is shopping around, looking at other models. He says, nope, it's got to be this one. I'm going to take my dead robot out, and I'm going to find somebody to take me out in the wastelands to get a new one.
So who do you get to take you into the wastelands to find a sex bot?
Well, if you're David Andrews here, you get Melanie Griffith.
Yeah.
Who plays this tracker.
She's basically Mad Max in this movie.
Yes. Now, I have to say, Melanie Griffith, David Andrews, they went on, I think, to be better utilized in other films, but they are rather lifeless in this picture.
There she is.
Yeah, but which is ironic given that we have robot humanoids at the center. But there's a lot of other fun stuff in this. So the future city is great. We already saw the beautiful gel colors. The Sexbot dealer scene is great. Robert Zadar is in it.
Oh, I love Robert Zadar.
A very muscly Robert Zadar, too, I have
Robert
to say.
Zadar is one of my favorite character actors to show up in these B movies from the 80s. He's in a great one, I think it might be from the 90s, called Future War, that was on an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Maniac Cop.
He's in Maniac Cop. In Future War, he plays a cyborg who has dinosaurs that work for him. And it's good. And he does Kung Fu at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
So you're probably wondering, well, how does Cherry 2000 relate to this episode that you guys are doing? We talk about it like way more in depth in the episode, but one of the main high end sex bots that's actually available right now in the real world is called Roxy the Robot Companion, and we talk about it.
Well, hold on. This already exists as a product?
Yeah, not as much as this in that it's like, a fully AI conscious person that you interact with. However, it does have different personality modes. And so we talk about that in the episode, and this goes into the sort of objectification part, right? So the Roxy model has some different personalities. These are a few of them. Mature Martha. Young Yoko, which sounds worse than it is. Apparently Yoko is at least over 18 years old as a AI personality. And then there's Frigid Pharaoh, which is the one that really creeps me out. So the idea there being is that it's like the robot's playing hard to get, like that kind of thing.
Well, this is perfect because that scene we saw where he's looking at the different models, it's exactly the same thing.
Oh,
where
really?
he's saying, well, this is, and I forget the cute names they have for all of them, but, each one is a different, very limiting female stereotype.
Yeah.
And that is a common trope with sex bots, as I'm sure most of you are familiar, is that it is this robotic version of what a woman is created by a man for a man.
Yeah.
So even in this movie where you have this guy played by David Andrews who has a very seemingly loving, seemingly tender relationship with his sex bot, it's still kind of weird. Like it's still this guy who has this idealized version of what a woman should be that's serving him.
Yeah, absolutely. Our producer Ramsey is about to pull up a photo, I believe, of the actual Roxy model, so we can show you what it looks like. So so there's Roxy with presumably one of its various owners.
This is kind of at a distance, but given my limited eyesight resolution here, that looks creepy as heck.
Well, there are apparently multiple models physically, too. There are some models that we read about that don't have limbs, right? So it's just like a torso and a head.
It's the boxing Helena model.
Yeah,
that is...
Right. But then there's also, I do want to be careful that we don't shame people who use things like this.
No, one thing you'll get into is that obviously Robert and I are going to talk about this in an episode next week, is people's relationship to synthetically generated images of humans is widely variable depending on context.
Yeah. So Roxy has a really strange origin story. It was originally created as a recreation of somebody's friend who was lost in 9/11.
Oh, God.
So it was like a recreation of that, and then it just, somewhere along the line developed into this sort of commercial enterprise as a sex bot. It's made by the Heinz Company, which is owned, I believe, by True Companion LLC. They unveiled it at the 2010 Adult Entertainment Expo, so it's been around for 7 years. But yeah, so it's, you think, well, this isn't really something possible, and we talk about this on the show. Like, there's a long history of like sex toys, but actual sex bots seems like something that's probably science fiction. But no, they exist.
Right, and we also discussed this in the episode that certainly we don't have robot sex bots right now. But we do have sexual technology. Many of these products are marketed to and consumed by men and women.
Yeah.
And yeah, so as we try and envision the future of sexual technology, we have to look to what's the shape of it now and realize that even though most of the sex bots we see in movies are females designed for men, the reality would likely be far more balanced and not even necessarily as human as we see depicted.
Yeah, so actually going further into that objectification route that people are concerned about, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we're going to play another scene. This actually isn't a trailer. Most of you are probably immediately thinking of Westworld, which was a huge hit last year, had plenty of sex bots in it, right? And Tandy Newton, of course, is like the main sex bot in the new Westworld. She has this very interesting sort of like character journey throughout the TV show. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it for people. But this is a very early scene in which, she's with a customer and he's using her like a machine, basically. To the point where apparently he has like a choking fetish and he starts like hurting her. And, that is obviously something that goes into play in just Westworld's larger philosophy, right? That like these AI are basically there to be hurt and killed, or done, whatever can be done to them by the humans who pay money to be there.
Yeah, and it does ask ethical questions that have gone back for years now, but are going to become more salient, I think, as humanoid robots become a standard part of our everyday life. It's always been a question in, video games and things like that. Like, is there an actual brutalizing effect that happens on humans if you are causing harm to a simulated entity? So does running around in a video game just murdering people, nobody's really getting hurt when you do that, but could you still be having some kind of negative effect on the world by brutalizing yourself, making yourself feel more like it's okay to do things like that, or changing yourself in some other way?
Well, this is something we discuss quite a bit because this is a big divide, right?
Yeah.
When people are discussing the idea of sexual robots, would a person that's going to victimize someone, a person who has that inclination and that temptation, if you present them with a robotic person to victimize instead, then is that good? Are you preventing an actual human from being harmed?
Right.
Are you ultimately just emboldening them, or are you just going to egg them on to actual violence? Or is there, or even in some of these models, I mean, if as AI gets advanced enough, are you just creating a new theater of crime? Are you creating something that's just as bad or nearly as bad as victimizing a human?
That's a separate question, and it gets into the question of whether you could have a machine that truly thinks, has consciousness, has feelings of its own. In Westworld, I think this is something that's highly ambiguous. The AI is so good and the robotics are so good that you're constantly lulled into the sense that these are not unthinking machines, but they have some kind of internal experience, just like we do. But then again, it's impossible to know if they're programmed to act like they do.
Yeah.
They might just be unfeeling machines that have no experience, and that either way, that would put a strong dividing line in the ethics question of abusing robots. But then, there's this other question. Even if they're not feeling, are you really making the world a worse place by abusing these things that look and seem like humans?
Well, that is exactly what Dr. Kathleen Richardson is arguing. So she's one of the people we talk about in the episode. She's a robot ethicist at the Montfort University in Leicester, and she heads the campaign against sex robots, which has its own entire website, which we looked at and used for research for the episode. CASR, I believe, is the acronym that they use. She calls for an organized approach against the development of sex robots as a necessary response. And her argument is that sex robots, just by being built, reflect human principles of dignity, mutuality, and freedom, and that subsequently, just the very fact that we're building them, we're representing violence, discrimination, and coercion. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't do that because it's symbolic of our worst tendencies.
So is this aligned with or separate from the idea of desensitizing ourselves to causing violence? Is it?
I don't know where she falls in the violence category, and I don't think that it's necessarily mentioned in there.
Well, I mean, you could think about it as if you are, I mean, I know some people would have the view that having sexual relations with a biomechanical organism, something like that, if it's programmed to do that, that sort of blurs the lines of consent and stuff like that.
Well, it gets even... So let's throw another wrench in the works.
Okay.
So I don't have the notes in front of me here, but another topic that we talk about in the episode is that there is specifically a company in Japan that designs sex robots for pedophiles. And the idea being is that these childlike doll sex robots would keep these pedophiles from performing crimes against children.
Is there any evidence that's true?
Well, so this gets kind of complicated because there's a lot of evidence regarding pedophile offenders, but it's led some experts to say, well, we might actually have two basic categories of pedophiles. Now, of course, there are multiple categories of pedophiles, but the idea that you have a category of pedophiles that are going to be more likely to act on their temptations, and you have another population that is able to keep it under wraps. And we don't have a lot, if that is indeed a subset of pedophilia, we don't have a lot of data on those individuals.
So this is controversial stuff. I'd like to know from the audience, so we can talk about it with you, what do you think about this? So do you agree with Dr. Kathleen Richardson? Do you think that just the very idea of sexbots contributes to violence and discrimination and coercion, especially in a sexual sense? And then related to these pedophilia bots, do you think that that's something that could help a pedophile keep their urges contained, or do you think it's something that may exacerbate it? Those are questions I'd like to hear from the audience from. I think, though, that we're in a good position to move on to our next trailer.
Yeah, let's see if we can get a male sex bot in the mix.
Before we do this, I want to remind the audience who we are. We are the hosts of the Stuff to Blow Your Mind podcast. You can find us at stufftoblowyourmind.com, or you can look up Stuff to Blow Your Mind on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, I think, all those places. We're the hosts of a science show that talks about, weird, confounding topics like this.
Yep.
So today we're talking about sex robots, the ethics of sex robots, and maybe we'll talk some about the realism technology too. I don't know.
Well, yeah, you guys got into that a little bit for the episode that you recorded for next week, so sure.
Don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, we'll have more on this subject coming up. Now, if you want to leave comments and ask questions, please do, but just a reminder that we're not going to be responding to your, gross sexist garbage. If you've got something that's not productive, don't bother.
One thing we will do, though, is if you're watching this after it was live, we will respond to the comments afterwards. So this isn't like a one-shot thing.
Right.
We will pay attention to this video file after it goes up on Facebook throughout the weekend. We'll be checking in on the comments and responding to you.
All right, well, let's move on to our next film. This is one that I don't think any of us have seen, but our producer, Ramsey, who's running the machinery here for us, he recommended this one. This is 1987's Making Mr. Right.
Okay.
It's from the director of Desperately Seeking Susan, and it stars not one, but two John Malkoviches.
What?
Yes.
This is before that was cool.
Right,
Before it was cool to have John Malkovich play multiple characters.
Yeah,
So you're not talking about two different actors, both named John Malkovich?
No, well, it's the same John Malkovich, but you get twice the Malkovich.
Okay.
Is that Annie Potts?
No,
Okay.
It's not. That's I believe Susan. Is it Susan Siedelman as?
Okay.
No. That's the director. The character here is Frankie Stone.
Okay.
If we had the audio up, you would hear Frankie Stone's got it all as the narration as she's buying a bunch of fashion magazines. This, however, is. This is her partner here. This is John Malkovich. Is a brilliant scientist.
Malkovich looks a little like Michael Shannon here.
He does. But so there's a real John Malkovich scientist, but then there's his android that he's created.
Got it.
And he's
Okay.
created the android to go into space
Okay.
in his place. But the whole gist of the movie is that she falls in love with the robot, and then the human ends up going into
Weren't we
space instead.
just talking about Malkovich last week, and we were kind of like talking about his early roles and sort of wondering when it was that he spiked and became popular? Maybe this was it.
We're talking about how he isn't necessarily all that great at doing accents.
Yeah,
Right.
his Russian accent and Rounders. That's what it was. We were specifically reminiscing that.
Now, this movie also looks like it has turned up the 1980s aesthetic to 11.
Oh,
This is
yeah.
the thing about, I don't know if I've told you guys my theory about this, but if you go back and look at science fiction movies from the decades of the 20th century and how they project the future, it's essentially taking the elements that we think of as most distinctive to that decade of the 20th century
Yeah.
and amping those elements up beyond compare.
Oh,
So
yeah.
movies made in the 60s about the future look like hyper 60s. Movies made in the
Yeah.
80s about the future look like hyper 80s.
Yeah, for the past 5 or 6
Especially,
years.
like, you think like a movie like this is at the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course it's going to be accentuated.
For the past 5 or 6 years, I would say that most of our science fiction has basically looked like an iPhone. Like in one way or another, it looks like an iPhone.
Actually, so this film, even though we haven't seen it, but the gist we got from Ramsey talking about it, seems to relate sort of to the idea that came up in the podcast, which is that women actually use and buy sex toys more than men, according to research. So there's kind of a disparity here because the sex bots that are being built and thought about right now are very specifically built by heterosexual men for their entertainment, right? But the market is actually much broader than that.
Yeah. So maybe we'll reach the point where there'll be a John Malkovich sex bot in every home.
Maybe we need a Malkovich
Yeah.
one. I remember that person who built the Scarlett Johansson one last year.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
That was a
maybe
whole-
they can
yeah.
build a Malkovich one, and we can even things up a little bit.
I mean, that gets into a whole other question of the ethics of sex robots is like the license to use a real person's likeness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, that seems like a pretty gross invasion.
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't remember from the news reports. How did ScarJo feel about that whole thing? Does anybody out there know?
I don't know.
I wonder if she was cool with it, if she just didn't say anything about it, or if she could have probably very easily litigated against that person.
This reminds me of some of the territory that Joe and I will get into next week when we discuss not only the uncanny valley, but the idea of getting beyond the uncanny valley. When things like this become possible, we just mostly talk about digitally in our episode, but the idea of it becoming physically possible to completely replicate an individual, how problematic is that?
It looks like we got a question coming in, maybe?
Do we have any good?
More of a statement.
Oh, it's a statement? Yeah, it's okay. You go ahead and tell it to us, and while we're waiting on that, why don't we take a look at the old Westworld?
Oh yes.
So not everybody knows this. Westworld is based on this old 70s movie written by Michael Crichton, starring Yul Brynner. This is the sort of comparison of the sex scenes from those two, right? So you got one with Candy Newton from last year where she's getting strangled and sort of brutalized. And then this one is this more like, this guy's a little bit more tender and awkward, and he's sort of like confused about how to behave when he's a robot. He is the human, she is the robot.
Really a more optimistic scene than you said.
Yeah, and actually I think that connects to the therapy angle that we were talking about in the episode, right? So this guy
Я хочу тебе кое-что сказать. Для меня это важно.
And then he has this experience with this robot. It does seem like it's awkward. We don't really see a whole lot of it.
Я просто раньше никогда...
Her putting her clothes back on and walking out the door. But
Мы
Dr. Kate Devlin has actually
так мало знакомы,
are essentially
понимаешь,
sex
о чем я?
toys that could benefit from
Только что встретились,
feedback. She also points out that despite sci-fi visions like Westworld
Ты очень
and
хороша.
other things that we've seen, that humanoid sex robots, they don't necessarily have to look like humans. They could be anything.
Yeah.
Like, so, you know, one thing we talk about on the show is like fleshlights, for instance. That's not exactly like human looking. Or the
rabbit.
popular rabbit, yeah. So this is like sort of an idealized
странно.
version in that it would be like another humanoid-looking thing, but I believe Robert says something to the effect in the episode of it could look like a Roomba.
Yeah, or like I was also thinking of a mechanical spider that crawls out of your closet when you push the right button on your phone app. And this bear with us, Joe. And then there's this idea of the therapeutic sex bot, and I found this really interesting, and I actually did a science fiction spin on this for Now this week, How Stuff Works Now.
Yeah, so if you're unfamiliar with what that is, it's a portion of HowStuffWorks.com that we occasionally write for, and there's articles on. So if you go to now.howstuffworks.com right now, you should be able to find that article by Robert.
Yeah, and basically the idea is that I guess the closest thing that you would find in today's world is the reality of sex surrogates, which are not. This is not like a prostitution thing. This is a therapy-based initiative. I think based in psychotherapy, where if an individual, particularly, I think that most cases are older male versions who have severe anxiety about their abilities or inability to form relationships with people and have the confidence they need. And in some cases, the sex surrogate will actually have physical sexual activity with them in order to break them through that.
Right, yeah. And so one of the things that's really interesting to remember here, too, is, like, you're probably hearing this and you're saying, like, oh, like, therapy, that sounds like that's hokey to me or whatever, right? But think about this. Like, it was about 100 years ago. Doctors were using what we essentially call... Oh, we got a comment. I'll come back to that in a minute. Doctors were using what we essentially call dildos or vibrators now to stimulate women who were suffering from hysteria, right? So there were, like, mental illness issues that were connected with this. And now, as that technology progressed, it was like around the 1930s, I believe, from our research, that it became commercially available. That stopped being a thing that doctors had to address. So this technology may have benefits. All right, Joe, you want to read this?
Yeah, it looks like we have a comment answering our question about the ethics of sex robots. This is from Nick, and it looks like Nick says, I really think it's just on the individual. So it looks like this is about whether sex robots could escalate people's bad tendencies or avert them.
Okay.
I really think it's on the individual. I feel like some people might escalate their behavior with Sexbot, whilst I feel others will be able to use them to channel their particular kinks. I guess I feel like both sides of the argument are valid, but it's really up to the psychological state of the person using the bot. And I think that makes a really good point.
That sounds fair, yeah.
So obviously there's no one answer that applies across the board, and so in questions about ethics, there would be a certain amount of situational ethics that would come into play.
Right.
But the broader question would be, if you're making consumer technology available, you're probably not going to be regulating who you sell something to. So you sort of do have to look at it from 30,000 feet and say, like, is this by and large something we want available to people or not? Is it going to cause more harm or more good?
Yeah. Why don't we get into our next trailer to think some more about that? This is actually another scene. It's not a trailer because the trailer for this movie doesn't feature this character at all. This is from the movie AI, which many of you will remember, that Steven Spielberg directed. It was originally a
Stanley
Kubrick film, yeah. And this is Jude Law playing the male sex robot Gigolo Joe. And what's interesting here is I had no idea Paula Malcolmson is in this movie, and she plays one of his customers. Paula Malcolmson may be familiar to those of you out there. She plays a prostitute in Deadwood. She's Trixie in Deadwood. And she's also in the Hunger Games movies. As I think she's the mother in the Hunger Games movies. But so anyways, the idea here is that Gigolo Joe is this kind of sensitive male sex bot that's developed for female users. And it's interesting to take a look at that, compared to what we've seen already.
Yeah, because it's, in a sense, this is very therapeutic. Of course, you could also argue that this is also based in a very sort of sexist idea of what a sex bot would be for a woman versus for a man.
Yeah.
But still, it's rather balanced in a way, and shows the idea that this would be a situation where a robot could help not only replace human interaction, but help a human that is suffering through something or experiencing something get back to the point where they can have actual relationships and physical relationships with another human.
Yeah, you can see here, even without the sound, that the Paula Malcolmson character is clearly having a very emotional experience here. She starts crying. So actually, this is in relation to Kate Devlin again. In an interview in 2016 with The Guardian, she argued again, she said, women are actually more likely to purchase artificial non-human substitutes such as vibrators, and subsequently would also be more likely to purchase, a sex bot, maybe a Jude Law one.
Yeah.
So this is interesting. Like, we've got this weird thing where right now the technology is really like in this sort of male-dominated space based on who's creating it, although the consumers could potentially be more female.
Yeah, I'm hoping, though, there will be 3 models available. The Jude Law, the John Malkovich, and the Robert Zadar.
Oh, there's a Robert Zadar
Yeah.
sex bot? Yeah. That's just for you guys, I think. That's a very special thing.
Also the William Hurt, right? Isn't William Hurt at the beginning of AI?
Is he?
Oh,
Is he a
yeah.
robot in AI?
He's
I
like
can't
the
remember.
robot designer.
Oh, okay.
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 Yeah.
Back
Oh,
to
there's
Robert
Zadar again.
Zadar.
Oh,
I don't know.
God
How many
bless him.
people out there would have sex with a Robert Zadar sex bot? Let us know in the comments.
Now, this is probably a good time to remind you who we are. We are the hosts of the Stuff to Blow Your Mind podcast, a science podcast that tries to peel back the curtain on reality and show you that on any given subject, there's probably more than you thought.
Yeah.
So today we're talking about sex robots, about how they've been realized in movies and in fiction, and then also about the real-world ethics and questions surrounding this subject in the burgeoning field of sex technology.
So, are you guys ready to get into my favorite clip for this? It's best for last. Have you guys seen Ex Machina?
Oh yeah, that's a great movie.
So this is my favorite scene from Ex Machina. If you're unfamiliar with this movie, it is about the creation of not a sex bot per se, but a robot with artificial intelligence where you're trying to test basically to see if it can emotionally interact with the people that are testing it.
I think one of the things addressed by the movie is that a robot with true, total, across-the-board simulation of human intelligence would probably include a sexual element.
Yeah, and that comes up in our episode too, because the idea of creating a humanoid machine that behaves and even thinks like a human without any sexual connotations is kind of ridiculous.
We talk about this in the episode that, like, let's think about this. Like, a huge portion of the human condition and how our brains react to the world around us is based on sexuality. So, of course, if we build things in our likeness, it's going to be related to that. So, as we're seeing here, this is the classic scene where Oscar Isaac dances with one of his robots, which it's never explicitly stated, but it's implied that he's having sex with this robot.
Yeah,
Right?
Oscar Isaac's character in this movie has a very gross, implied abusive, or not always implied. You see a fully abusive relationship with the androids he's created.
Yeah, very Dr. Bro is kind of how I like to think of him here.
It's a great movie if you haven't seen it, written by Alex Garland, one of our favorites here on the show. But again, so this brings up some of the research that we covered in the episode. There's a British author, he's a chess master and a CEO of a company called Intelligent Toys Limited named David Levy. And we talk about him in the episode because he wrote a lot about this in a paper called The Ethics of Robot Prostitutes. And it's from a book called Robot Ethics that came out in 2011. And basically his argument here is that the only time that sex bots would become like a real problem, like take the scene, right, is if they actually had artificial consciousness. And that's actually the difference in this scene, right, is that from what we know in this movie, this particular model isn't really conscious, right? Like she's programmed to perform various tasks such as dancing or sex.
Though with artificial intelligence movies, you always run into some realm of ambiguity.
Yeah.
Because you can never really know. You can't get inside the black box of another consciousness, so it's hard to know. But what if they act a lot like they're conscious?
Well, and then
that's the other robot in this movie,
The other thing is that you always, well, maybe not always, but for the vast majority of these cases in films, you have an actual human playing the humanoid robot.
Right.
So the human aspects of it are pretty much nailed. Like, it looks and feels and just seems like an actual living human. So that kind of complicates things.
Now, it sounds here like Levy is weighing in on the other side of this debate from the person you talked to earlier. So we talked about the two different horns there. Like, is it only harmful if you can actually harm these robots, if they're having a conscious experience?
Yeah.
That seems to be his point of view. He doesn't seem to buy into the idea that you're actually doing a bad thing, even if the robots can't be hurt, even if they're just a machine.
One thing I've wondered here: what if you had advanced consciousness capability with an artificial humanoid machine, and you had like a strong law, like an Asimov's laws of robotics situation, where whatever you're having them do, like, it's impossible for it to be non-consensual. Like, no matter how strange, how weird, or even criminal, if the machine is designed to always be 100% cool with it. Like, that's something you don't encounter in the human version of this.
There's no human analogy for that.
Interesting. So, how are we doing for time? We've got a couple more videos, but I want to make sure that we get time for questions and comments. And that we don't, go over too much.
Yeah, if we hit the 40-minute point.
What time is it? 7:44. Yeah, should we wrap up?
I think we should wrap up.
Yeah,
Okay.
so real quick, if anybody out there has any more questions about this topic, stuff you want to talk to us about, let us know. We'll hang out for a couple more minutes.
We will try to get into the comments afterwards.
Yeah, and we'll do that too, yeah. But so this is a really fascinating topic, a lot more deep than I think, no pun intended, that I think, we ourselves thought about when we were getting into it, but also like our listeners. We've had several listeners write into us already, and it's only been a day, and they've said, wow, I was so impressed with how you handled this particular topic, because I really thought that it was going to be something that was going to squick me out.
Cool.
Hopefully we didn't squick anybody too bad. But
Well, one more time, if you want to listen to this episode and you haven't heard it already, you can go to stufftoblowyourmind.com. And it will be the most recent episode up. But also, wherever you get your podcasts, go there, subscribe, follow us, download the episode, give it a listen.
Hey, you know what? Today is the last day of Tripod. We should throw that out
so
there,
we
too.
definitely want to say thank you to all the listeners out there who have hashtagged us and done all that other stuff on social media. Tripod has been a month of people recommending their favorite podcasts to others. And
so if you're unfamiliar with it, and you're a fan of our show, basically the way it works is on whatever social media platform you're on, you use the hashtag Tripod, TRYPOD, and you tell people about podcasts that you like that you think they should listen to. So it's like helps discovery basically with these shows.
Tripod, you're trying pods. That's what it's about.
Exactly.
All right.
So simple.
we are the pod people.
Okay. Well, doesn't look like we have any questions in here. I really hope that you enjoyed what we did today. I enjoyed watching just the scene from Ex Machina alone, and also some of that Westworld stuff. That scene was so uncomfortable and awkward, and that movie's like, 40 years old at this point? Something like that.
Yeah. And hey, I can't recommend Cherry 2000 enough. At least the first third of it. If that trailer looked interesting to you, go find a copy, because it's just such a wonderful mid-1980s vision of the future.
We've got not a question, but a comment.
Okay.
All right.
In every one of these movies, you have science going awry. I believe there is more fear than actual objective projection.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you weren't able to hear that, it sounds like there was a question where it said it's about most of these films are about science gone awry, and that they're about fear rather than actual projection.
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is I might recast them as technology going awry.
Right. Yeah, they're very technologically deterministic.
Yeah, but one thing is that even if this topic makes you uncomfortable, as I think for most people in some way or another, it probably will make you somewhat uncomfortable. Technological progress is not really something that you get to you can't put a stopper on it. It's happening without you. So it's something that we probably should be thinking about. Like, even if this isn't a topic that interests you, and I don't know what that would mean, but
another great movie.
You might want to think about the implications of it, because it's probably going to be something that becomes more and more technologically possible either way.
Another great movie that we talk about in the episode, but we didn't use today because of some technicalities, is Blade Runner. Pris, the Daryl Hannah character in Blade Runner, is technically a sex bot, although she's a replicant. She's
basic
a clone
pleasure
of
unit,
a human being, but she's created specifically for sexual purposes, right?
Yet again,
Excuse
there's
me.
a strong element of wondering whether she's having an internal experience. It's very much implied that she is.
Yeah, and Blade Runner, I think, more than some of the films that we talked about today, really does a good job of making you ask yourself that question. Is like, how is this thing or person experiencing this? And
Well,
it gets back to that consciousness
Yeah,
question.
and I think it's important to note too in all this, you basically have the Jurassic Park element in play.
Right.
So science fiction is almost always sometimes it's often about our hopes and dreams for technology, but it's about our anxieties concerning technology and contemporary issues. And ultimately, when you have a film that's going to deal, especially with something like sexual robots, there's more drama in looking at how they're going to go berserk and go crazy,
Right.
and the ethical problematic aspects of it, as opposed to
That's
some
true,
of these more beneficial and more optimistic views of the future. But I think we always have to keep those in mind, because if we just try and navigate the evolution of technology based on our worst fears, then where are we ever going to go?
What's that movie? Oh, it's got Gene Simmons in it, and he's a mad scientist who's building these
Runaways.
weird robots.
Yeah, another Michael Crichton picture, if I recall.
Yeah, there you go.
Selleck's in that as well, isn't
Who
Tom
is-
Selleck.
Tom
Tom
Selleck.
Selleck is also in
it?
it.
Ramsey in it.
Oh, really?
That
Okay.
always creeped me out.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that is a weird movie. But to your point,
Speaking of
if
creeps,
we saw
Gene
something like that
Simmons.
and we kind of went into the future with it and thought, well, this is what the future is going to be like, that's probably not a good idea. All right, I think that wraps it up for today.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, or tuning in live, or catching this video after the fact.
Yeah.
And be sure to hit up stufftoblowyourmind.com, check out the episode, and write it in the comments. Let us know what you thought.